the predators, so to speak, there believe that only the strong survive. So I started to develop into my own mental frequency that the only way to survive life in that jungle was to outdo the opposition's frequency of aggression in my direction. The origins of a lot of these gangs in terms of like symbols date back generations to witchcraft. And let's say you get into like additional issues while incarcerated, like I did, in terms of racketeering, extortion, multiple assaults on male staff officers. At this point, my nature is so like ignited with tension and aggression. I guess analogically, you can reference that to a hair trigger on a firearm. Very, very quick to respond when it came to thoughts and feelings of being either disrespected or threatened or challenged in any way, which I'm sure had a lot to do with the various demons that I was afflicted by and possessed by. Was rage. Rage was, I remember it feeling just unnatural. I was just trying to write my mom a letter when this individual sitting across from me, I guess I wasn't responding to him the way that he preferred or wanted me to, and that just triggered like me to react, and I dropped the pen, the paper went flying, I attacked him, and I beat him to the point of what I thought was unconscious, but I didn't know that he had what they call a shank, that he was armed, because he never displayed it. He never reached for it during our physical altercation.
Hi, welcome to Touching the Afterlife. I'm so excited to have with us today Daniel. Daniel grew up in the murder capital of the world, and he deviated from God and began to do drugs and alcohol and started in a gang and even ultimately ended up in prison and started a riot in prison.
In the beginning, like you said, I had a traumatic roller coaster of a ride. Introduction to life. I was born and raised in Gary, Indiana, which at the time was the murder capital of the world. And I'm sure that being so close in proximity, maybe 30 to 40 plus minutes just outside of the Chicago, Illinois area, a lot of those urban issues overflowed out of that area over next door to where we were. And by that, I mean concerns regarding murder, drug dealing, prostitution, gangs. It was a rough life. A lot of challenges went into cohabitating that geographical area for young people in general, but it was a major distraction for like young people when it came to just, being outside, going to school, just trying to survive. I remember that the general mentality in that era and time was equivalent to life in a jungle. And just like you have certain categories of life in the jungle that dominate and prey on others, it was a similar lifestyle there. A lot of the predators, so to speak, there believe that only the strong survive. So growing up with constant opposition in that state of mind, I started to develop into my own mental frequency that the only way to survive life in that jungle was to outdo the opposition's frequency of aggression in my direction. So at a young age, although I was being born and raised in a Latin Pentecostal Church of God, the ethics there, morally and spiritually, were being basically conflicted with my environment's like method of operating and surviving. My family, they were attempting to raise me morally structured, and they would enforce through the incorporation of their faith and beliefs, spiritual principles. But when I would leave home, which that worked very well for me at home and at my church, but in my community, in my environment, once I left those two locations, home and church, and then went into like the public, it was almost polar opposite, the experience, because moral standards and spiritual principles was not the way of life in my community. They believed in stealing and lying and killing and just a lot of contrary messages, that they would exchange and promote and highlight. So between elementary and middle school, by that point, I was starting to come into a lot of internal conflict with what's working for me personally and what's not. because I was being constantly confronted and victimized and challenged along the lines of those beliefs and those methods of me incorporated into like my lifestyle in terms of like the public school system, for example. So when sometimes I would be approached and attacked racially, just for being different, or my interests would be questioned with others in comparison with others, you know, feeling and believing and living different. I really didn't have a point of defense in terms of my understanding, because at this point I was growing more and more lost in my confusion, trying to understand and comprehend why life was so different outside of my home, outside of my church, you know. So in the public school system, I got to a point where I made a conscious decision after many occasions of having been assaulted physically and verbally abused and just racially discriminated against, and at times having been physically injured as a result of those physical assaults by multiple people. Sometimes individuals would approach me and attack me, but sometimes it wouldn't be just like a one-on-one thing. Sometimes it'd be multiple people just riding down. And I started to wonder about, as I looked in multiple directions, the way that people were starting to just gather in groups and align themselves with certain like categories of people. Some were affiliating themselves with like certain specified groups, gangs, or organizations, like they like to refer to themselves as. And I started associating with just different groups of people, just to kind of get a better, broader understanding of why they were the way they were, because they were, like, again, so contrary to the way that I was being raised. And a lot of the common answers that I got from multiple directions was that they were just looking to relate to and connect with whoever provided them with what they were lacking and missing, like maybe in their own homes, like love and respect and, you know, communication, acceptance. So that semi made sense to me at the time. So I started getting more involved with a particular group of people that were in my immediate general vicinity of my community, my city. And I found the ability with them to relate. They were very welcoming. They were very, you know, supportive of one another. I love that, because I was growing up in a household pretty much by myself. I didn't have, you know, siblings to interact with. You know, my mom, she was really strict when it came to, with good intentions. And I believe that was God's wisdom at the time, because she was trying to shelter me from being exposed to anything that could potentially have a negative impact or influence on my life. But the more and more I got further away and started spending more and more time away from home and away from church, because now you're talking about a church attendance of once, maybe twice a week. At the time, Sundays church, Wednesdays were like a special service for like young people. So at max, we're talking twice a week. I'm connecting with God, and the rest of the week, the world, through the public school system on a daily, Monday through Friday, and then on the weekends, friends. At least I considered them at the time. That the more time, like in any relationship that you spend with someone, you start incorporating and adapting to their ways of thinking, the way they feel about certain things. And it got to a point where I made a conscious decision to align myself with their belief systems by affiliating myself with them. I'm not going to give any glory to that particular, by name, that particular group of people or organization that I affiliated myself with, because I just feel that, you know, if it's not like a godly reference point, I just don't feel comfortable giving any recognition, or at least too much honor or respect in any other direction other than God. But I will say this, that to this day, I don't have access to most of those individuals. Some have died in that darkness that they were a part of. Some are incarcerated for long periods of time. But I do love and pray still for them, hoping that one day maybe even through our ministry that we're working to launch here soon and establish, because it does have a particular category of prison ministry. So from the affiliation point, though, in my life, there came a deeper, darker involvement with, like, I'll just call it sin, because it was almost like that one conscious decision to become affiliated with that lifestyle in terms of gang affiliation. It brought on demonic, like a demonic presence. I didn't realize, I didn't see it and understand it for what it was, being young at the time. But gang affiliation of any kind has a lot in origin with witchcraft. And I say that because if you break down the colors and the symbols that we engrave to it, like, you can't tell right now because I'm fully clothed, but my body is tattooed, my upper body in a lot of areas with a lot of these symbols that at the time you're only presented a limited amount of information that, hey, these symbols represent an allegiance to a way of life that binds us together. But the more and more research I'm doing into witchcraft currently, just to understand why it's so prevalent in the world we live in today in our modern day society, the origins of a lot of these gangs in terms of like symbols date back generations to witchcraft. And as we engrave them into our bodies through tattoos, they're equivalent to blood rituals, sacrifices, and allegiance that we pledge ourselves to, allowing these spirits to come into our life and wreak havoc. Because spirits, they're not just geographically assigned. In some cases, they're attached to objects, people, things, different concepts. But moving right along from the gang affiliation, once I was involved with that, I became obsessed. And that's what I meant earlier when I said it almost invited a whole different way of thinking and way of feeling. I got consumed, whether it be by the spirits driving me now, or whether it was my own lack of understanding and my own personal quest to just excel. I started getting into a more aggressive state of character and personality, because I was repeatedly finding myself in conflict now with anyone that was at war with that particular faction that I was aligned with. And at the time, gang warfare was pretty common. Everyone was fighting over territory, drugs, in terms of not so much usage, but sales, because gangs use drugs to finance their campaigns. The more wealthy and materially established they are, the more they seek to accumulate more people and more territories to grow and develop. So that takes me right into the drug dealing, because through my gang affiliation, I established connections with pipelines of various materials to indulge in and profit from. One was cocaine, two different levels of that, crack cocaine and powder, which had two totally different categories of clientele. Crack cocaine usually generates people more aggressively looking to, and when I say aggressively, I mean desperately looking to, they just have to have that high. So that introduced me to an accelerated rate of income generating. Powder cocaine, because it's a different method of indulgence. It comes with a milder category of people indulging in it, because they do it more recreationally. It's not as a desperate impact on the person. It is addictive. Both are, crack cocaine and powder cocaine, but powder cocaine usually comes with a category of functioning addicts, like attorneys, doctors, government officials, people that can still do whatever it is that they do and indulge recreationally or periodically off powder cocaine. Crack, again, just to recap, is something that's, people are chasing that, whether they got money or not, and they'll do whatever it takes to acquire it, whether it's steal, lie, even kill for it. So with the cocaine came two categories of income. With the marijuana, that came with three different categories of income generation. One was a synthetic form of it, which was hydro. Hydro was a chemicalized version of marijuana. Purple haze red-haired cess, which was a Jamaican strand that I was bringing in from out of the area. Various categories of pharmaceutical drugs, from 3 different types of Vicodin to 3 different types of Xanax to 2 different types of Valium. I was just getting ready to break into the ecstasy realm when I ended up encountering like my first incarceration. But I did the gang thing, the drug distribution thing, for a few years before my first incarceration. We're talking a time frame now of from 14, when I actually detached away from God, church, and my family, to 17 now. So 14 to 17, I encountered my first incarceration. And that was for possession and distribution of a controlled substance, which at the time came with a sentence of 6 years, served 3. By that I mean state time. There's a variation between being incarcerated and serving state time in comparison with federal time. Federal time in those days required you to serve at least 80+% of whatever it is that you were sentenced. With me having or accumulated 6-year prison term, I was only required to serve 50% of that sentence, which on a 6-year sentence was 3. The way that they calculate that is, as long as you're not doing anything and you're serving your time without any incident, then for every day that you serve, they give you a credited day. So for example, on my first day, that came with an extra credit day. So at the end of the 3 years in the system, it would look like I had complied with the 6-year term. If you're not free from incident, let's say you get into like additional issues while incarcerated, like I did, in terms of racketeering, extortion, multiple assaults on male staff officers. And we'll get into why I highlight male staff officers, because in there, they do have female officers that hold various positions. Some are officers, some are counselors, some are other administrative. They hold positions of responsibility there. But I never really had any conflict with females growing up in or out of the system, because I was raised by 2. And my initial encounters and experiences with females were always good, really well, in fact. So when I went into the system and I found myself in that situation, I started to conflict with male officers, because that area, the facility that I was incarcerated at, it suffered from a lot of like racial discrimination. And being under that supervision and authority, I found it, really difficult to submit to anyone over me that I felt just had like a biased regard towards me, or an unfair like demeanor. And they made it clear when you're dealing with racism. I believe that's a spiritual demon in itself. At this point, my nature is so like ignited with tension and aggression that I guess analogically you can reference that to a hair trigger on a firearm. Very, very quick to respond when it came to thoughts and feelings of being either disrespected or threatened or challenged in any way. And that first incarceration, that was the 1 out of 3 that was the tip on the spear when it came to my worst in terms of rage. I'm not even going to call it anger, because there's a difference between anger and rage. Biblically, anger is something that we're all equipped with by God to war against unrighteousness. We're called to have a righteous anger, a holy anger, that the suppressor is God, against sin, against injustice, against unrighteousness. But what I had at this time, which I'm sure had a lot to do with the various demons that I was afflicted by and possessed by, was rage. Rage was it. I remember it feeling just unnatural. I remember people telling me like the look in my eyes would change, like tangibly the atmosphere around me when I flew into a state of rage would disrupt other people's. They said they can feel it physically. So with that, at this particular point in my life, it fueled what came after. That incarceration consisted of multiple physical assaults on male officers, um, batteries after physical batteries on male inmates, issues came with that incarceration of charges, internal facility charges against me by staff regarding extortion, racketeering. My mom at the time, she fell ill. Her health was failing. And I remember requesting from maximum security because I was serving, I want to say it was like a year, maybe two, for aggravated assault on an inmate. That, speaking of my mom, that's how this inmate and I ended up in a physical altercation, because I was writing her a letter on my bed. And this facility's security frequency or level was medium security at the time. But every prison has an in-house facility enhanced version of a security location called maximum security units, where basically they send you for a specified amount of time. As long as it doesn't like exceed your initial sentence. Like, for example, me being in this facility, I was supposed to have been there for the 6 year serve 3 time frame. While serving the 3, and this physical altercation came with a segregation sentence of 1 or 2 years. So what they did was, since it didn't exceed my initial prison sentence, they transferred me from general population to the secured housing unit that they called, at the time it was MSU, which is basically an acronym for maximum security unit. And when I got into that physical altercation in general population, I was just trying to write my mom a letter when this individual sitting across from me, I guess I wasn't responding to him the way that he preferred or wanted me to. And if I remember right, I was trying to tell him that as soon as I'm done writing this letter, composing this letter to my mom, I'll deal with you, accordingly. And he hauls off, threatening to decapitate her by her decapitated skull, and that just triggered like me to react, and I dropped the pen, the paper went flying, I attacked him, and I beat him to the point of what I thought was unconsciousness, but I didn't know that he had what they call a shank, that he was armed, because he never displayed it. He never reached for it during our physical altercation. So when I heard the correctional officers signal code 1010, which is what they use to communicate with each other for an extraction team to be summoned whenever there's like a conflict among the inmates, they use that code to bring in like task force equipped officers to intervene and control the situation. So when I heard that go over the radio waves, because they all have like a electronic communication system, I disengaged from the inmate, again under the impression that he was neutralized and unconscious. And when I turned my back to him and went to walk away, he reached for what we call shanks, which are jagged pieces of metal with a handle incorporated onto it. And he ended up stabbing me in my lower back. That brought me to my knees. And had it not been for another inmate that was at the time an associate of mine, he was a Golden Gloves boxer from Muncie, Indiana. His name was Price. He kicked the inmate in the face, therefore causing him to drop the weapon. And then Price kicked the blade away from him so he couldn't reach it again. By then, the COs had entered. They breached the area we were in and ended up restraining both of us. I went to the infirmary for my injuries, and which an infirmary in the Department of Corrections system is like a hospital. It's like a medical care facility. And until I was better enough to be transferred from there to maximum security. And maybe about a year into being in maximum, I was still generating monetary gain from maximum security through extortion, through racketeering, through various categories of opportunities that I had still accessible to me. Because the thing about gangs and the prison system, the prisons are run by gangs. And what I mean by that is they control all of the illicit and unlawful activities there with the assistance of the officers. Now, the facility that I was currently serving time at the time was classified the 4th most corrupt institution in the United States of America, because the staff were involved with prostitution, where the females would prostitute themselves to the inmates. There was cash flow being circulated, which isn't supposed to be in there, between the inmates and the staff, which covered that category of income generation and profit, referring to the prostitution. There was drugs being circulated in there, brought in by the facility staff, and just a wide range of different issues and concerns that were occurring that contributed to its designation being the fourth most corrupt facility in the United States of America at the time, and the inmates being involved in all types of different illegal and unlawful activities, because some of the staff were gang active members themselves. Some were doing what they were doing just for personal profit and money. But the only difference between doing all of that inside of a prison controlled environment and out here is that the profits are 10 times more lucrative, meaning for what you would pay out here for an increment of, let's say, like a marijuana joint or cigarette. I don't know even what they call it anymore nowadays. Back then they were called joints, which are like little cigarette rolled up measurements of marijuana. Out here, that might cost you a few dollars. In there, it could be anywhere from $10 to $30, same amount, just more expensive because of what you go through to access it in there. All the risks are amplified, enhanced in there. So that's where the profits skyrocket. Another example being tobacco. When it was outlawed in there to legally smoke, that took cigarettes from whatever they were, that converted the cigarette hustle or trade in there to a $6,000 a week, which doesn't sound like a lot, but when you're talking about a pack of cigarettes being, a few dollars, to being able to buy a can of tobacco and make hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of dollars off of selling, small increments of that, it turned into a profitable business. It seems like that's the case anytime anything's outlawed. Drugs, tobacco, alcohol, whatever. Profits increase. So I end up about a year or two into this sentence that I'm serving inside of the prison facility for aggravated assault on that one inmate. And my mom, that's where her health started to fail. And she started to become borderline terminally ill. So I put in a request, not knowing that I didn't qualify because of this particular status of security. I didn't qualify for a transfer because in order to qualify, you have to be 1 year clear of any conduct reports. And at the time, I was on every restriction, maxing out on my sentence. At the time, I don't even remember having the option to ever return to general population, because if I remember right, that prison preferred me to serve out the remainder of my sentence in maximum security because of me being a consistent thorn in their side when I was in general population. A lot of that had to do with just the influence that I had accumulated in general population through my gang affiliation. I was constantly initiating conflict with staff and other inmates. So they just didn't have any intention on ever allowing me to hit general population again. So when I found out that I didn't qualify for transfer, my concern was if my mom died, that I wouldn't be allowed to go see her, because ordinarily, if you lose an immediate loved one, they do allow you access to an escort, an armed escort, where prison officials transfer you to the funeral and then return you. Not an overnight thing. It's just their thing and back, and you're under consistent restraint. You're under consistent supervision, surrounded at all times by an armed escort. Armed meaning firearms, multiple at that, categories of it. Handguns, shotguns, assault rifles. So they go above and beyond to ensure that you don't try to abuse that privilege in a way of escape. So that information about me not qualifying for a transfer came through a lieutenant that informed me after my request had been denied that that was the reason. And I just wasn't okay with that. So I started to devise a way to another option. But it was that same lieutenant that told me I didn't qualify, that also informed me that there is an alternative, and it's called a disciplinary transfer. I'd never heard of that. So when I questioned him about it, he explained to me that what a disciplinary transfer is, it's an enhancement of your current security frequency. In my case, since I was already maximum, in order for me to qualify for a disciplinary transfer, I would have to enhance my maximum security status to super maximum. Now, super maximum facilities at the time were being designed after Pelican Bay Prison in California as a level 5 secured housing status. It was basically designed to occupy disciplinary issues from other prisons. So it was a facility of itself. So I'd have to be transferred from where I was in maximum to supermax at a different geographical location. But the lieutenant had clearly explained to me that that was going to come with extreme circumstances, meaning not only to qualify, but once in that status of security, it was an enhancement of my current restrictions in terms of, like, for example, in supermax, you only get to shower Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. That's it. Not Tuesday, not Thursday, not Saturday, not Sunday. And you're only allowed out of your cell, which you're individually incarcerated, in a cell for 30 minutes a day in an area that's confined by 20-foot walls. The only opening you have is at the top of those 20-foot walls that you're in a rectangular area of. And at the top, it's covered with a mesh, an iron fence mesh with cross beams of solid steel and security cameras on you at all times. Now, before you even make it out of your cell, they won't even open that cell without you turning around, sticking your hands behind you through the little door inside of your cell door that they use to feed you trays of like food or paperwork, if they need you to sign whatever. And when they put handcuffs on you from behind, then they'll open the door and 3 armed guards are waiting to then chain your legs, one ankle to the other with shackles. And then they take a what they call a trip leash, which is equivalent to a chain that you would walk a dog with. And they use the part that clips to the dog's collar. They use that to clip it to the chains that are now thread between your ankles. And then they run the trip leash underneath that chain, and then they walk you with it. That way, in case you start to give them a hard time of any kind and you become uncooperative or unruly, they use that chain to pull your legs out from underneath you. So that's the method that they walk you to your shower on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, or to recreation daily for 30 minutes. And then they return you to your cell. Same process, just in reverse order, meaning that they unchain you, and they'll first remove the shackles from your legs, close the door, have you back into that same initial position so you can put your hands through that little doorway to release the handcuffs off your hands. And but what got me into that status was once I acquired the information from the lieutenant that was actually, and I don't want to say his name because I don't know if he still works there, so I don't want to get him in any trouble. He actually, I look back at him almost like a blessing, because he was one staff member I can honestly say that was genuinely concerned with the safety and security of not only his fellow officers, but us as well too. Because when he approached me, that's how our rapport was established. He wanted to understand, he wanted to know, what is it that is your problem with us? I just want to fix whatever the issue is, and hopefully there won't be any more animosity or conflict between you and my staff. So when I explained to him about my mom, that's when he had volunteered that information about, look, there's only one way out of your status right now, and it's supermax. And this is the price you're going to pay for that ticket, So with that in mind, the decision is yours. And with that information, I processed it for a few days, and on my range, meaning where my cell was in maximum security, that was just one of 11 other cells, which occupied other people. And during the time frame that I'm processing this information that he gave me, that's my only way out of maximum security to supermax, another inmate came onto that range with similar charges as mine. And I remember his name was Ontario Campbell. His nickname was Yo-Yo. He was a high-ranking gang member for his gang. And overhearing a conversation of him being in a similar situation as mine, with my mom being, ill his son was experiencing that on his side. He was concerned about his son and wanting, if something happened, to have access to his son. And I knew of this individual because we had a mutual acquaintance from a different gang that apparently that gang member, Ontario Campbell, had a personal relationship, socially speaking, with another gang member named, I don't remember his like lawful legal name, but I remember his nickname was Ron C, RON-C. Ron C and Yo-Yo were friends from Indianapolis, Indiana, from the streets. So Ron C, being from a different gang than Yo-Yo and me, but being under the same nation affiliation as I was, that's where the puzzle pieces started to fit together. Because basically what Ron C is between Yo-Yo and I, even though Yo-Yo and I didn't know each other personally, Ron C was the bridge connection between us two. So with that mutual acquaintance, when I came into the awareness of that, I approached Yo-Yo, blew him what they call kites, which is a message written for him to read about the information I was in possession of. And that information regarded a disciplinary transfer. Everything that the lieutenant provided us with is what I shared now with Yo-Yo. And he was receptive in a trustworthy way because we had a mutual acquaintance. The way he thought, the way I felt, the way Ron C looked at it, it was basically like, okay, you and I don't know each other, but we know a credible source that can vouch, that can substantiate our credibility in both directions. So it took a little bit of time, not much, to confirm that. But once that was established in Yo-Yo's mind, that was all I needed to know, that he was willing and capable of managing his resources, which was his gang. The influence and position he held was able to call his organization to action. And with my position of influence in my direction, I was able to do the same. And we orchestrated at that point an institutional takeover that took exactly 1 month to coordinate, because from maximum security, we had to communicate all the details of that to general population so that everyone would be briefed and informed on what to do when the time came if our demands weren't met. And we only had one transfer. That's all we wanted, with the understanding and agreement that if the facility staff honored that request, the threat that we were proposing or initiating would be neutralized. It took that month to coordinate everything. And just as an added measure of assurity, what I used to substantiate the credibility of that threat was that I had someone outside of the prison, which was a family member. I had her receive a letter that was handwritten from me that had instructions, specified instructions for her to mail this to the superintendent or warden of that facility, instructing him that by the time you receive this letter, what I'm in the process of orchestrating now will have already occurred, as an example of what's to come if the demands of this letter aren't met, which again was just transfer for not only myself, but Yo-Yo. And it was only initially supposed to have been a dual transfer for him and I. But at the end of when all the smoke had cleared, so to speak, and by smoke, I mean the aftermath of what I used as a reference point to solidify my threat was 2 maximum security units having been utterly destroyed, 17 male correctional officers having been hospitalized. It wasn't 18, even though they sent 18 to restrain us, because the 18th turned out to be a female correctional officer that when I brought her down and ripped the face mask off of her face, I didn't know she was a female till I ripped the face mask off of her, because they come in riot gear, which is like tactical padding with helmets, and like it's body armor is what it is. And at times they incorporate chemical agents just to, and dogs, they sometimes, depending on the situation, they'll bring in those 2 categories of enhanced security. But they didn't use chemical agents with that situation or dogs. We were anticipating that they would. So we had phone books and additional artifacts of clothing wrapped all around us. We didn't have access to their degree of security in terms of body armor, but we made our own. It's common in prisons for people to use phone books to protect themselves, like you would incorporate a bulletproof vest against bullets. We use phone books to protect ourselves from being stabbed. We used extra uniforms to protect ourselves from the dogs, but again, they didn't incorporate chemical agents or dogs. When I realized by ripping the face shield off the female officer, she was a female, I was in shock, not realizing. And before I could say, I'm sorry, I didn't know that you were a female. She used her foot to put into my sternum and kick me off of her, causing me to strike the back of my skull on a radiator, like a heater, an old-fashioned heater system that they had. And when it split me open, I remember getting up angry, and I instinctively, my hand went to my head and it was gushing blood. And I remember like walking towards her, and she balled up in a fetal position. And I told her to go home. You don't belong here. And I turned away and unleashed like my anger on other male officers that were at the time in conflict with Yo-Yo, fighting. Eventually, they ended up overpowering us because it was just him and I against all of these officers. But and they kept bringing more and more and more until we just finally ended up. Well, Yo-Yo ended up in a wheelchair from the beatings that they put on him, and I ended up pretty banged up too. They stripped us completely nude, chained us in a hog-tied position, drug us to an isolated room that was surrounded by concrete and steel bars with only a drainage sewer pipe in the center. And then they unchained us. There was a camera monitoring us at all times, and that's where we were able to use the restroom to relieve ourselves. I stood in that state of being for 19 days, and because this was like January, February, that particular time of the year, it was cold. It was so cold and so hard that when I laid on that concrete, I would wake up with like bruises on like my skin. And then of all the times in my life to get measles, that's when I ended up afflicted by that. It was really an intense situation. But that letter that my cousin, I had instructed her to mail to the superintendent, gave him a time frame to honor that request of 21 days. At this point, we're in these states of being for like 19. And on the 20th day, they drugged me out, and they said that I needed to come with them. I didn't know where I was going, but they brought me into a room that was in an administrative, what looked like a conference room. I'd never been in there before, but I say a conference room because it had a long table. And when I walked into this room, mind you, I'm chained with my hands behind my back, shackled, and there were armed guards all the way around the perimeter of the room. And at the end of the conference table was my mom. My mom's daughter. I called her mom, and I called her mother Mommy. Mommy is the one that's ill terminally. Mom, which is her daughter, because they were both raising me. So I looked at them both like mother figures in my life. Just one was older than the other. So mom, the daughter now, is sitting there in confusion because she's like trying to talk to me in English by saying what's going on. Like, I've never been in this like state of visitation. Why are you chained like that? And why are these guards like surrounding us with like these weapons? Because my mom, she's like real anti-firearm, real like peaceful. And, the maximum peak of her aggression is her raising her voice. And it's not even that loud, So she's like very anti-violence and aggression. So she's looking at like all of this visually as like intimidating to her. And I told her to communicate with me in Spanish, because looking around, there wasn't anyone in that room that even looked like remotely they were capable of speaking our language, which is Spanish, because I'm Puerto Rican, I'm Hispanic. So in an effort to explain to her without them being able to understand what we were saying, I was explaining to her the situation and what led to this and how, what was she doing here? She said that she had been communicated by the superintendent of the facility that the institution was on a complete lockdown because of what was going on. And that if at all possible, he'd be willing to approve a visitation with me if she were to agree to an attempt to discourage everything that was going on at the time. And she did try. When she explained that to me, I told her that at this point, everything is so far along that there is no turning back. She went on to further explain that I was facing additional incarceration time, 6 to 20 years for everything that was occurring, ranging from the assaults on staff to the destruction of state property to just a bunch of potential additional charges to what I was already facing and serving. So I listened to her, but basically I told her to just go home with a message to our mom, and that's tell her that soon, I don't know exactly when, I'll be in touch with her again. And she cried. She broke down crying. The last thing I remember her saying was, if you get 6 to 20 more years added to your sentence, Mom, she's not going to survive that long. So I didn't respond. She left. They escorted me back to my cell. And I just thought about what she said. And the very next morning, they came to Yo-Yo's cell and I told us cuff up, which meant, cooperate with them securing us. And they transferred us. The approvals got processed, and they ended up transferring 3 of us. Yo-Yo's friend ended up on that ride with us. He was Yo-Yo's right-hand man, so he ended up going. The lieutenant was the last familiar face I saw at that facility before he rendered us into custody of the supermaximum facility that was there to pick us up, to intercept us. And he said, I need your guarantee, your personal, your word that after you're gone, there's not going to be any retaliation or any further extenuating circumstances as a result of this nightmare. And I told him everything is already taken care of. All they need to do is make a public, well, when I say public, I mean a facility-wide statement about the transfers, and that will disengage everything from potentially occurring at that time frame that we had designated, which was the 21-day time frame. And I ended up going to Supermax, and when I got there, one of the benefits to a disciplinary transfer is once you get there, all of your prior restrictions, because now you're in a different facility, are reinstated. So with that came my phone privileges being immediately available to me. I was able to call my mom. She was really excited to hear my voice. Because of the institutional lockdown, I hadn't been able to communicate with her up to that point. Couldn't write because they weren't allowing any inbound or outbound correspondence to be circulated as a result of the threat that we had initiated. Because that's how we used. That was the method that we incorporated the Postal Service to circulate information to everyone involved of what we needed them to do. And I ended up serving the remainder of that initial first incarceration in Supermax with no further issues. I got a chance to occupy a location with the worst of the Midwest. At the time, it housed 250 of the Midwest's worst disciplinary issues from various prisons. They were shipping them there from every other prison in the Midwest at the time. And I got a chance to see and hear a lot of different people's mindset towards other people during their stay there and what their intentions were when they got out. A lot of it was graphic, but with that in mind, I'll just say it was a dark state of mind that place was dense with like just people's nature there being at the worst frequency humanly possible. Again, no one's there for good reason. But when I got out, I never forgot those experiences. And someone asked me once, they said, shortly after like my conversion years ago back to God, when you were out there lost in all that wicked, evil, state of being, did you ever hear or see God at all during those times? Or were you so far gone that you were beyond like his voice or his sight? And I thought about it because that was a really good question. And then I don't know if it was God in that moment that gave me the revelation, but it's almost like he downloaded all the different times that I was at my worst in situations, worst meaning life-threatening, intense, point of no return. He enabled me to see that the entire time he was always right there, which is the only reason I made it out, and many others. So absolutely, yes to that question. And I believe that's a message in itself for the world today, because a lot of people struggle. If that's not their leading concern, it's among the top. Living in the world that we do today, they have a hard time seeing and hearing, discerning God's presence or his voice. But he's there. That's without a doubt. He's there. I'll give you a reference point with the last two incarcerations that I'm about to briefly cover now, because we spent so much time on the first. The second incarceration that I returned back into the state of being imprisoned was similar to the first, possession and distribution of a controlled substance, because the only variation between the first incarceration for that and this second one is that initially when I was incarcerated, I was employed by someone else. The second time I was employed for myself. And when I went in on the second, every time that you're incarcerated, if it's for a similar category of offense, they enhance the time imposed. For example, the first incarceration consisted of a 6-year serve 3 sentence. The second was a 10-year serve 5. And I go in now leaving behind a daughter. And I realized that she was 3 at the time, and I was a single parent. I realized that even though my intentions to raise her lacking for nothing, I wanted her to have the best life had to offer financially and materially, but this is where I went wrong with that. The method that I used was, it was immoral. And when you try to establish any kind of success at the cost of other people's misery, that's never going to work out. So when I ended up separated from her, I realized that the decisions now I'm making in life, they just only don't affect me anymore. But now, because I'm already in that situation, I have to face those consequences. And while I was detained, having been a single parent, I never had like legal custody of her. So her mom was able to remove her from like the care of my family. And because my family, they were like, hey, take care of what you need to take care of, and know that your daughter, she's solid with us. She's well cared for. They loved her. They and I laugh because I was remembering prior to the incarceration, my mom, I didn't know how to teach her how to be a little girl. She was growing up to be a little boy, like a tomboy, because I was raising her to dress like me and basically move how I move and be into everything I'm into. Not that I was sitting her down saying, do this and do that and be like this and be like that. She was a child. They're very impressionable, very, as adults, children are influenced by what they see and what they hear, especially in their immediate vicinity. So my mom stepped in and she was like, oh no, we're not gonna have her running around and looking like a little boy and acting like a little heathen. So we're gonna maybe her being your daughter, we can teach her how to be a better version of you, and maybe that'll help you reflect on what really matters. So they used to take her to church, and they took her shopping, and they had her in dresses and barrettes and all these other things they would put in her hair that I don't even know the names of. And she was having a good life. I used my finances illegally acquired, but I used it to basically provide for her with whatever she wanted or needed. But now in the state of incarceration that I found myself in, I just wanted to get back to her as soon as possible. So at this point in my life, I had retired. My daughter was supposed to have been a boy. By that, I mean, she wasn't conceived in the natural way that the typical boy meets girl would transpire. She was bred. By that, I mean, in the gang world, we reproduce with the intent for whatever, at least in our organization, whatever ranking position we held in authority, whoever we were mated with, it wasn't based on mutual attraction or compatibility. It was based on your rank, her rank, your purpose within the organization, hers, and we would pair one another accordingly and then breed. So never did I anticipate in my ignorance that my daughter would be born a girl. I didn't see past her being reproduced to, you know, to be a son, a boy. Occasionally her mom would ask me, what if she's a girl? And I would say, then she'll take after you. And but I just expected the boy. But when she was born a girl, that did something to me. Like that, I don't know if you've ever heard scared straight, but it's one thing for someone to ask you, what if she's a girl? And then another to see her and hold her. And I remember holding her for the first time. And I can't explain it. I can't articulate it. But the regard, now I understand that it's unconditional love. But that experience at that point in my life, I couldn't explain it. I couldn't understand it, fully comprehend it. I just did not want this life. Her mother is mine, this world. I didn't want that for her. I just wanted her to just be happy. And whatever the cost came with that, I was okay with it. And so I retired, actually. Because as long as I remained active, she would be obligated. And as long as her mom was active, she would be required to also activate at a particular age. So her mom, I retired willingly, consciously. Her mom was forced into retirement because she developed a health condition called epilepsy. So she was forced into retirement and replaced by someone else to carry on her responsibilities as an active member of our organization. And when I retired, I basically took my daughter in a different direction and tried to, I didn't promote and highlight that gang life to her. Tried to shelter her as much from it as possible by being selective where I took her to, who I brought her around. I didn't have a problem with I didn't attend church at the time. It wasn't, I couldn't be further away probably from God at the time, but I didn't mind my mom taking her to church, and she liked it. My daughter did. She enjoyed it. And my family, again, they're Latin Pentecostal church-going people, so she was in an environment of like morals and spiritual principles, and she was loved. She was embraced in a lot of good ways. I was probably the biggest threat to her, living the way that I was, in terms of, 1 foot in freedom, 1 incarcerated, 1 in this life, and 1 in an early grave, which almost took place and ended up almost fatally gunned down in a public location as a result of just my past life. But again, God miraculously intervened on that and brought me through it. And I ended up when I did get detained and reincarcerated. Now that I wasn't gang active, I ended up dedicating myself to an earliest possible release. So I enrolled in anything and everything they had to further my education, to reduce my time, because for everything that you accomplish in that state of incarceration, you get what they call time reductions for. For example, if you get like your GED, you get like 6 months reduced off your sentence. If you post your GED, you successfully accomplish vocational training, which in my case, I went from the GED to small engine repair and welding. So I got that certification, and they knocked off more time, which wasn't as much for the GED. I think the vocational training only came to 3-month reduction. Took substance abuse, because even though I never really had a problem, I was more addicted to like the financial and material wealth behind the circulation of drugs. In that state of incarceration, that also came with a time cut. So when I looked at it, it's like, even though I'm not addicted to any particular chemical substance, the information, the knowledge and understanding of it can help me with dealing with family members that were friends that I knew that had that demon in their life. And I ended up walking out of that second incarceration prior to its initial sentence designation. But prior to that release, throughout that state of incarceration, I remember God blessed me with a social casual relationship with a Christian correctional officer that her name was, I don't know if you know what, I in this particular case, because it doesn't involve anything like negative, I'll say her name. Her name was Tanya for short, Campbell, Miss Campbell. To me, it was Miss Campbell, but I remember her telling me her name as we got to know each other. And initially, her approach wasn't embracive by me at all. It really, relationships with staff, it was discouraged among inmates. It was frowned upon. So I, at every advance that she would attempt to, because her intentions were noble, they were sincere. She believed, according to her, that God had spoken to her concerning me to minister to me. And I had never, ever, even when I went to church, heard anyone say that God talks to me. I've seen and heard people pray, and that was their way of talking to God. But as far as I knew, the Bible was all we had to go on in terms of him speaking back to us. So I thought she was crazy when she told me that. She literally, because I asked her that just to make sure I wasn't crazy. I said, now, when you say God speaks to you, or do you mean that he like talks to you, like, and you hear his voice? Just like, yeah. She didn't even hesitate, didn't even think about it. That's when I knew I thought something was really wrong with her. But come to find out, everything was right about her. And God was using her. I just didn't know to what degree, as an instrument to what was coming that I didn't know. That I don't think, even ever would have imagined her and I coming together on how we did and what happened. Briefly, though, an inmate lost his life. He had some health reactions that caused a response team to be incorporated into his situation. And in the process of that, he died. And because he was an active gang member, his gang interpreted that death as being negligent. And they assumed it was ill will or out of spite that the officers, if not intentionally killed him, did it still irresponsibly. So they sought to retaliate. And this occurred in maximum security, that particular designation of the prison. At the time when I met this correctional officer, I was in minimum security, which is a complete different department of the prison, because they don't like to mix minimum security inmates with medium security and up. One, because minimum security inmates have a shorter out date. So when you got people getting out soon, housed among people that in some cases don't have out dates or aren't getting out for a long time, sometimes those inmates look at short timers as out of jealousy and envy. They target them in different ways. So when this officer, being someone that worked, they called her a floater, which is basically someone that's on a standby status. They assign her to an as needed state daily, which consists of her being in different security levels in different areas of the prisons. And that's how she was able to come into the awareness of this situation. And then out of, we call it trust or our rapport personally between each other, share that information with me, to the extreme that she went beyond that and asked me if there was anything that maybe I can suggest to reduce the tension, to help the situation. And I told her honestly, you know what, ever since my daughter was born, that I'm desperately trying to get back to, I haven't been gang active in now years. So even if I had access, which I don't, from minimum to maximum, there's a whole security level in between us. I'm in minimum, then comes medium, and then maximum. I don't even have access to those people, which I don't even know because it's a different gang. She's like, yeah, but God used you in that other situation, and well, he didn't use me. He preserved me is what he did. What I didn't know is he was about to use me in this. So I told her, yeah, he did. Yeah, I can't say that he didn't in that initial situation, because I'm only here because of that. Still alive, meaning. But she said, I said, I'm sorry, I can't help you. And as she was walking away, she looked down and she said, you know, I understand why you wouldn't want to get involved. But me being what I am, an officer that doesn't have any authority to manage where I'm positioned, I could end up right in the middle of that conflict. And you remember what that was like when you were in conflict with those officers in your past, how intense that can get. And I remember thinking, it felt almost like she didn't strike me physically, but the reality hit me almost like a like 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 a slap to my face in terms of consciously now being aware that it was true what she was saying. And I thought, I don't feel the same way about anyone else, meaning her coworkers, like I do her. So when I made the decision that I'm about to make now, I told her, okay, I'll do what I can. I don't know what that's going to look like. I don't know where to even start with that. But you have my willingness to cooperate with. I'll follow your lead. And she smiled and she said that's all I needed to hear. So that night, I laid down and I went to sleep. And all of a sudden, I hear a commotion and flashing lights, which are like flashlights, facility flashlights from staff officers, waking me up and telling me to cuff up, which means cooperate with them, chaining me. They're taking all of like my personal property and transferring me. They didn't say where they were taking me or even what the reasons that they were doing what they were doing regarded. But I found myself bypassing medium, going right into maximum, and being put right into the location where the gang that had the issue with the staff that was planning the uprising against them were all housed. So when I became aware of that, wow, what are the chances of that? And it turns out this is where it gets crazy, because rationally, looking back at it now, she could have had the strategic contribution behind that positioning. But what she couldn't have known, or anyone for that matter, is the people that are orchestrating this uprising, this particular riot, are the same. Some, not all, but some. I remember two particular individuals that were involved in my initial situation. So that's when I started looking at it like, okay, this is beyond random coincidence. And I ended up communicating with them. I didn't get into any specifics about the source of this credible information, but by credible information, I mean that I had facts that substantiate that death of that gang member, it wasn't intentional. It wasn't out of spite. It was an unfortunate tragedy. It wasn't intended. And that it was just that. It was something that didn't warrant retaliation. And they were surprisingly accepting of that based on our previous relationship from years prior. So looking back at it now, I look at it like God initially, from the beginning of our relationship, with that, our meaning the relationship between the correctional officer and I, and him being above all things, like the Bible says he is, and I believe that he is, ultimately just intervened in everyone's best interest. Because that's one clear way to identify God in any situation, is when you see that whatever the situation was and whoever it consisted of, it was a mutual benefit. So that ended up working out better than I think any of us anticipated. I was returned to my initial security state of being, which was minimum, and I got out. I wouldn't say that my relationship with God was where it should have been post that incarceration, that one being my second. But one thing I didn't forget, and I'll call it a seed planted through that correctional officer, is that God was definitely still concerned with me. And he was definitely still doing what he does. God became a reference point to me through her. And I carried her in my thoughts and in my heart from that point on, in a special way, because she had told me that her husband, he suffered from the demon of drug addiction, and that he used to physically abuse her and verbally, and it was a mental and emotional roller coaster ride for her. And that she looked at me like someone that, and she didn't mean this in a negative way, but she said, when I found out that you were here for what you were, this is early on in our getting to know each other, she said, that was so hard for me. And when God pointed me in your direction, I didn't want to engage because I looked at you like people like you that do what you do, meaning dealing, drug dealing, are responsible for people like me being victimized. And God just continued to press in on her. And that like really struck a chord with me, because a lot changed in me through our relationship, meaning her and I. By that, I mean my regard for authority, where I used to look at them initially as like my enemies. I may not have dealt with the females as aggressively as I did the males, but I still hated them just as much. I just wouldn't, based on my upbringing, lash out at them in a physically violent way, because my mom raised me to that way. By that way, I mean, there's a scripture reference in the Bible that states, if you train up a child in the way that they should be or walk the path of, in particular ways, meaning when they're older, they won't depart. And my life has a lot in common with the prodigal son. You know, I went way out in left field as far as you can go, but based on his initial relationship with his father, he was able to find his way back home. And so was I, you know, in terms of different seeds being planted, not just from my family, but throughout my life when I was having or experiencing encounters like Miss Campbell. Just so many other reference points that God has now blessed me with the revelation to understand that you detached from me, meaning God, but he never separated himself from me. And now finding myself with 2 incarcerations on my belt, that leads us to our third and final experience. I was reincarcerated a third time for similar circumstances, except for one extreme occurrence. And during a drug deal gone bad, in an attempted robbery gone wrong between people trying to rob me. In the act of defending myself, I found myself against 5 armed individuals that were unfamiliar to me. I found myself in the Crown Point Lake County Jail for 9 months, facing 173 years of reincarceration for what I did to those assailants. And where I see God in that situation was, I had a roommate that was facing 64 years for murder, a cellmate. And he had already been there before I ended up with my charges and housed with him. So he had a while of walking with God in his situation and started to minister to me in mine now. So because we were facing, him and I, the most time, we, you know, spent a lot of time together, and he was telling me that, hey, you know, your life as we got to know each other, you know, none of it's random coincidence, brother. You know, every decision you made may have triggered consequences, but that was all a part of God's purpose in you. We all have that, he said. Him in his own way, me in my own way. He said he was the one that basically broke down this whole relationship with God thing being personalized and individual, one person to another. None greater than the other or more valuable than one another, but intimate between God and all of his people. So he basically, for 9 months, which is crazy because 9 months is usually the time frame it takes to conceive a child in terms of reproduction and birth. And at the 9-month end, before my trial was to begin, through Michael Payne was his name, ministering to me and me reading the Bible, and just, it was kind of like my timeout. You know, I was incarcerated now, separated from all the people, places, and things negatively that contributed to me ending up in that third state of incarceration. And I said, you know, one thing I haven't done through these situations is I haven't reached out to God through them. You know, always the first incarceration was me against the world with that Tupac Shakur mentality. The second one was basically not so much that state of mind in its aggressive nature, but just was focused more on me instead of a group of people or a way of being. But now, facing the rest of my life in prison, I'm like, well, according to my attorney, I'm not going to make it through this, because even if I don't get that amount of time in the end, I'm going to get enough to where I'm never going to get out again. I might as well, looking at that situation like a dead end, give God a try, tried everything else. So I genuinely started not reaching out to God to get me out of the situation, because again, my attorney was like, you're not going to get out. Your situation actually is going from bad to worse. Their first plea bargain, which a plea bargain is an agreement pretty much established between the court system and you, to where you accept the consequence of being incarcerated at an amount of time that you're comfortable with. And that can range, that particular plea bargain was Indiana's life sentence, which at the time was 15 years, served half of that, because again, I was incarcerated on state charges. And I was just like, I'm not, I don't want to agree to that. That's, at this point in my life, I already had served 8 years in prison. I didn't want to agree to that. Let's go to trial. And if you don't agree to a plea bargain and you go to trial, if you lose, they give you the maximum sentence, which in my case was 173 years. But if you win, then you go free. I looked at Indiana's life plea bargain as like, well, that's more time than I'm okay with. I'm just gonna trust God that His will be done, whatever that may be. And I started really just pushing in God's direction more, like, I want to understand you. I want to, like you would someone that you're genuinely interested in a person, like in a personal, intimate way. I wanted to experience God with no doubts of His, like regard for me or reality, or, I just really was sincere and genuine. Now being older, capable of reading for myself and trying to understand as best I could for myself, instead of going by what other people are saying or teaching or singing or praying regarding. So the day of my trial comes, and this is where I started to see a variation between that day and the previous 9 months. The judge that supervised my entire case for 9 months wasn't the judge that I was under the impression I was going to go before. And that kind of intimidated me, because I'm like, oh, this judge isn't even familiar with my case. Like, that's not good. Because now you got a complete stranger that's in charge of how the rest of my life is going to go. But again, having faith in God, I stood on one scripture that said, and it stood out to me because of my situation. It read, and this is God speaking, that I'm capable and willing to set the guilty free. I knew I was guilty to some degree, not of everything, because there was a lot of police corruption involved in that situation. But I knew that what I was guilty of warranted the rest of my life, in that situation, that was a consequence of maybe even beyond that situation, just my life in general, all had accumulated to get me to that point. It is biblical. You reap what you sow in life. So looking at it from that perspective, I just decided to just to submit to God's will, regardless if I agreed with it or not. And the trial began. Both sides presented their evidence, and the judge, after evaluating everyone's, facts and statements, all the police that were involved were there. Just all the key elements to my case were present that day. And his verdict was guilty. My mom, when she heard that, broke down. When I heard it, it was kind of like a cross combination between shock, meaning, okay, my life is over, and almost like this weight just came over me, like almost like, I don't know if I want to call it, or even you might say that it was just a loss of like hope or despair, but it felt overwhelming. And 6 to 7 seconds later, after saying I was guilty, he said, "But I'm acquitting you." I didn't even know what that word meant at the time because I had never heard it. So I raised my hand to question the definition of what exactly that meant. And my attorney physically grabbed my arm, put it down. He said, and he whispered into my ear, he said, "Do not say one word. Just listen. Because right now, I'm not exactly sure what's going on, but I need to understand whatever that is," which was confusing to me with what he said. But my attention went back towards the judge, and the judge said, because the prosecutor jumps up and, what do they call that? He objected, the prosecutor objected to the judge's decision for an acquittal. And briefly, what an acquittal is basically, in spite of your guilt, you're declared to be set free. And what the judge based that decision on was, because he went on to explain at this point, addressing the prosecutor, he says, "Mr. Bober, we've been friends for a long time." When I heard that, I was like, oh my God, these people know each other. And this is the situation that I'm in, like in a crossfire between these two. When he highlighted the fact that his personal relationship with this prosecutor, this is the judge. He said, "We've been friends for a long time, but let me assure you that there is not a court in the United States of America that's going to prosecute this man, let alone convict him, with his civil rights having been violated during the course of his arrest." And I was just trying to take in what he's saying, because I still at this point didn't understand what an acquittal was. And the judge finished with saying, "In my personal opinion, I believe this man is a menace to society, a dangerous person to himself and everyone around him." And with him saying these things, I'm like, wow. Now I'm really confused, because he's saying he thinks and he feels a particular way about me, but he's setting me free. I just didn't know it was freedom that he was getting to until he finished saying that I'm extending this individual an opportunity that I've seldom seen in the years that I've practiced law in other courtrooms, and one that I've never extended anyone in my own courtroom. And at that point, it's starting to dawn on me now that he's getting to like a good conclusion, because my attorney, when he took that opportunity to explain what an acquittal was, and when he brought his little court hammer, mallet, or whatever they call that thing that they hit the little wooden platform with, he ordered all of the evidence that had been accumulated destroyed, which that evidence consisted of multiple firearms, a lot of drugs. And the drugs and the weapons were mine, but just to highlight the drugs weren't. They were placed there by the police, because the way the corruption reference point that I initially made a few moments ago, the police really didn't want, when they arrested me, to take me into custody. Turns out that the 5 individuals that I had a physical altercation with were cops. And I didn't know that, because I didn't know them personally. When they tried to rob me, it was, I guess, apparently, according to police investigation during the trial, it turns out that a year prior to their altercation with me, they, in an altercation with an unrelated incident, one of those individuals had shot a Gary police officer and gotten away with it. So fast forward now a year later, when I'm in conflict with the same individuals, when the cop killer reached for his firearm and I defended myself, I ended up going down for attempted murder charges. The police, during the arrest, threatened me that if I didn't cooperate with them and that's file counter charges against that individual that I defended myself against, they were going to enhance my charges from possession of unlawful firearms, which was only like a misdemeanor, which I don't know if you're familiar with misdemeanors and felonies, but misdemeanors are lesser criminal charges than felonies. They said that even though all the guns, which they recovered 3 off me, they said instead of charging you with an unlicensed firearm, which is like a class C misdemeanor, we're going to enhance that to a felony for possession of a convicted felon, saying you were resisting arrest and that you attempted to engage in a firefight with us. And even though they didn't find any drugs on me, they had access to drugs that they initially presented to me when they were arresting me once I was at the station after I had been taken into custody. And they're explaining to me, hey, look, what we want is for you to file counter charges against this person that you had this altercation with. Say that it was a robbery gone wrong and a drug deal gone bad. You were just defending yourself, but he is the focus of our concern because this person is a known cop, shot an officer in an unrelated incident a year prior, and we haven't been able to really have the opportunity to get him until now. And I didn't want to get involved with that because in order for me to, and their proposal was, you know, all your charges will be at bare minimum.
Yeah. So they wanted to use you as a pawn to be able to use your situation to work for what their agenda was.
Exactly. I like how you said agenda because that's exactly what it was. And in order for me to do that, I would have to confess to being involved in that self-defense incident. And initially I was saying, you got the wrong guy. I'm not the person you're looking for. And they were like, well, we know that it was you because there was, you know, like enough information accumulated to prosecute you beyond reasonable doubt. And the reference point that the judge used about my civil rights turned out to be a technicality. And that technicality was that the physical confrontation and altercation occurred June the 16th of 2006 at a He Ain't Here, which is the name of the establishment, the bar that the altercation occurred at. A week, maybe two later, at the same location is where the police caught up to me. And when they approached me, I was armed with the, I had one in an ankle holster and I had one on my right hip and I had one in the small of my back. And because I was actively dealing at the time. So when they approached me and they asked me for my ID, I cooperated and gave it to them. And even though they had me surrounded, they asked me, did I have any drugs or weapons on me? And I said, I do have weapons on me. They said, are they, well, how many do you have? And I said, 3. And they said, are they loaded? And I said, yes. They're not chambered, though, meaning there wasn't any in the, you know, like ready to fire. But the clips were fully loaded. And they said, well, where are they at so that we can take them off you? And I said, I told them where they were. They disarmed me. The officer that left with my identification came back, yielding results that I wasn't who they were looking for. And this is why. Even though they had the right person, someone ID'd me getting into my cousin's SUV. So the plate that was reported was his vehicle. So when that number was processed and it came back in his name, they thought that that was like me. Even though I was a passenger in the vehicle, my cousin was driving, it's his vehicle legally. They made a technical mistake with processing the charges of that night. So they had a description of me physically with the wrong identification information. And at the point where they're returning my identification saying, thank you for your cooperation, you're not who we're looking for. Some of the officers went to walk away, but one in particular paused and hesitated and said, you know what, why don't you step outside? And he escorted me outside where the other officers were. And he was like, you said you said you had weapons on you, which we saw. You said you didn't have any drugs on you. Mind if we search you? I said, no. At this point, I'm not familiar with the law. I don't realize they're violating my civil rights by continuing to like basically interrogate me when now they have no, according to their results, legal grounds to continue. And when they said that, well, do you have a permit? They didn't find any drugs on me, even though I did have some, like over $2,000 worth of drugs on me, but it was in a hidden area that they only searched me exteriorly, like my pockets, my jacket. They said, you have a permit for all that hardware that you mean in the guns that were still in the bar? I said, no, they're legal. I just don't have a permit for this. Oh, okay. Well, we're gonna have to figure this out at the station. We're gonna have to take you in on a unlicensed firearm, which is just, they were seemingly carrying on like they were just having to do their job without any, like what you said earlier, like a hidden agenda or motive, in mind. So they went back in, collected the weapons, cuffed me, took me in. Once I got to the station, I said I needed to use the restroom, went into the restroom, flushed everything I had on me, because they weren't like monitoring me directly at the time. And they went on to sit me down. The guns now had the clips ejected from them and were on the table. I was handcuffed, sitting down. Across from me was the officer that was writing up the charges, and the rest of the officers were in the room. And the officer writing up the charges, he says, why you carry so many guns on you? I said, crazy world we live in, just never know. And he said, yeah, it is. I'm gonna show you how crazy. And he took one of the guns I had 240 caliber twin handguns and one 9mm all black Ruger. And he picks up the 9mm Ruger and reinserts the clip, chambers around, puts it to my chest. Now remember, I'm handcuffed with my hands behind my back. And he pushes the barrel of the Ruger. 9mm Rugers have like the barrel extends at the edge of the firearm. And unknown to me at the time, that I'm about to find out, when he pushed the barrel into my chest and he pulled the trigger, it didn't go off. I thought I was gonna die. So it shook me up. Adrenaline's like immersed throughout my system. He retracts the weapon and says, did you know that there's a kill switch on these and then he put it to his hand, and then he pushed in on the barrel at a sideward profile, showing me that when you push in on that weapon, it acts as a kill switch. Even though there's a round chamber inside of the firearm, it won't discharge. And I was like, no, I didn't say anything, because I was like, at this point, really like upset and angry. But he put it down, and he said, now that I have your undivided attention, I need you to understand something. And then he opens up a drawer, pulls out what looks like a white powdery substance, slams it on the top of the desk, and says, if you don't cooperate with what we're about to tell you, we're going to enhance all your charges from what I was saying earlier. Instead of a misdemeanor, possession of a firearm without a permit, we're going to write up that you resisted arrest, tried to incorporate these weapons against us, that we were in the process of trying to intervene during drug sales, which we have the evidence here, which aren't even my drugs. This is what we want you to do, and that's to write up the counter charges for armed robbery, basically accusing the person I was in conflict with trying to rob me at gunpoint. I just didn't want to do that, because if I did, I would be openly and willingly admitting to being the person of interest in that situation. I kept telling them, you got the wrong guy. I wasn't involved in any altercation or incident at that location at all. And they did what they said they were going to do. They went ahead and wrote up the charges like they threatened to, because I didn't cooperate. And when all of that came out during trial, it actually was ruled in my favor, to where I ended up getting blessed with an acquittal. Now, again, the acquittal only referenced my civil rights have been violated. So even though their allegations and accusations, I was found guilty of everything, the entire case was dismissed based on my civil rights having been violated, which goes back to the scripture that I stood on, stating that I'm capable and willing to set the guilty free through the prayers of the righteous. I forgot to mention, which is probably the most important part of that scripture, which was through the prayers of the righteous, because even though I was far from that, there were a lot of people, family and friends throughout my life praying that, I would be delivered.
Oh, I'm just marveling. I'm marveling at God's plan. First of all, it's a miracle, an absolute miracle.
Absolutely.
How God
Absolutely.
he'll use what he's going to use. That technicality is such a miracle, because like you said, you would have been in prison until you died for many, many years, and you were acquitted. It's amazing. And I marvel at these testimonies when I see God's plan is going to prevail, and his plan prevailed in your life. Amen. And so you were acquitted, and at this point, you had prayers. I love that people were praying for you. God intervened, and so what happened from here? I'm sure the mercy and love of God that He showed you, did that change you? I mean, what happened from there?
Yes, absolutely, 100%. It just shook me to my core. There was an old program. I don't know if it's still around today. It was called Scared Straight, and it was basically involving young people being introduced to what could be their potential outcome if they didn't deviate from their path of criminal activity. Excuse me. And for me, that's what that situation was. For me, it was a reality, like a wake up call, an awakening, if you will, to the understanding that they didn't, basically they're trying to put you away and throw away the key, and God didn't allow them to do that. So when I got out and I came home, my mom, she said, again, God has delivered you. You need to really appreciate that. You need to get a grip on that and get your life together. My mom, before she died, she didn't ask me for anything. Her love for me was like literally from 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verse 4 through 8, where there you'll find the most in-depth description of unconditional love that I've ever encountered. And that's the way that she like raised me through the good, the bad, and the ugly. She never like strayed from that frequency of unconditional regard towards me. So for her to ask me just this one thing, get your life together, that's all I want to see before I die. That really like did something to me, because I've always known her to just love outwardly, and serve others with never any benefit involved or desire for anything in return. So for her to ask me, just that one thing, that definitely was like something that contributed to me reprioritizing my life, because between that and my son being born, right around the time that she passed away, those were two extremes that took place literally days apart from one another. And I devoted the rest of my life when she died and my son was born to honoring that request, and that's to get my life, in a state of restructured being, the closest in proximity I can get it to what she would have approved of, and then lead my son when he got older by example, instead of just the way I grew up. Hey, I grew up in a generation that said, do as I say. And we couldn't really question that, I did, being the rebellious child that I was. But I didn't want to raise my children like that. I wanted to communicate with them so that they can understand, hey, I'm not just telling you stay away from gangs and drugs. This is why they're bad. I don't care if they tell you, because like Satan does, he presents you with things that look and sound appealing, but end in horrific tragedy. He did it to Eve, and he hasn't changed his strategy generation to generation to this day. I'll use gangs, for example, since that's one of the frequencies we covered today. Gangs promote love and acceptance and respect and all these benefits. But then when you find yourself in time, once you're in that situation, you start to experience it for what it is, the opposite of everything that they promised you and guaranteed. And that's what Satan does. He promised Eve a godlike state of being through her disobedience, and all it brought her was death.
That's right.
In the end. And
yeah, like you said, the rage she had was a result that came later on, but initially it was embracing of, we accept you, we love you, but then, like you said, that's how it ended up.
Yeah, that's the primary objective for our ministry. It's composed of different categories, but it's biblical based to offer people a genuine experience at God, because He's the foundation that we're building on, and God for who He really is, not religiously, not like in the world nowadays. I was in an interview with someone a few months ago, and he's a devout ministry leader, and I like how he said and explained that nowadays, church attendance and affiliation is almost like a social gathering, like an organization. It's almost like being marketed professionally, and they're losing sight of what the personal, intimate encounter with like God. Because someone asked me in the midst of that conversation, how would I capsulize, God? I'm like, well, I don't believe that's possible, because He's like so many different things to everyone, effectively speaking. But I can speak from my reference point, and in one word, I'd say relationship. That's where I wake up daily striving to engage with God instead of like on a regiment or a schedule to kind of defend myself against falling into like a religious like cycle. I challenge myself daily to connect with God, not just through church attendance on Sunday, but every day, whether it's through prayer, reading the Bible, through music, through sermons and podcasts. Because with modern technology, we have access to God on a whole other level, in a more advanced, enhanced way. So sometimes my connection with God for the day might be, feeding someone that's hungry, or going to visit someone that's incarcerated. Because my life, if I had to summarize my life in one word, it's resume. God enabled me to have so many versatile experiences. Some extreme in nature, some not so much, but still, they provide me with the ability to connect with a wide range of people. Not just biculturally, because I'm capable of I'm multilingual, so I can communicate with people in different language frequencies, which opens up opportunities to minister to people even further out than just being able to one-dimensionally do it.
Exactly. There's so many things that you've shared today where you truly break it down and you're able to relate and help people on all of those points, whether it was in the prison system and, just different things you experienced culturally and whatnot. So I love and I see how God's Jesus just through different people, a lot of times with these women, your daughter, the correctional officer, just different ways when you were speaking of how God used individuals and things constantly to bring you to this testimony, to this place where you're at today. It's amazing. It's such an amazing testimony.
I'm glad you brought up my daughter, because she's I just recently, a few months ago, I say recently, but it's been a few months, seen a really traumatic movie. It was rated the #1 movie in the world. If you haven't seen it, fair warning, it's pretty graphic, but it's a Christian-based movie called The Sound of Freedom. And we didn't get into it today, but my children, basically that movie is about like human trafficking, children being taken and abused. And in my career, I'm in the truck driving industry. That's something that, because they use that method of circulating victims, meaning those organized human traffickers, they educate us extensively on what to look for and what to be on guard against in an effort to better help people, because it's not just children, it's women. And if you think about it, women and children in the world we live in today are almost like an endangered species. And people are like, why is that? Well, if you think about it from a satanic perspective, what are children? They're the future. If they can be destroyed in any way, then you neutralize the future effectively from the devil's point of view. And women, what are they? The reproducers of life. If you can somehow compromise them, then you neutralize, reproduction, children altogether from even existing. And those are two areas in my life traumatic, because my mom, when she was a child, she was taken by someone that brutally beat her nearly to death and left her to die in a ditch. And if that wasn't bad enough, after he brutally beat her, he savaged her. And but he didn't think she would survive. So at 12 years old, a child experiencing that's a psychological nightmare in itself. But it got worse for her months later when she realized that she was pregnant with me and that I was the result of that. The only thing that saved my life from her terminating me was that she was raised Christian, not to believe in that as an alternative. So she carried me full term. But at birth, couldn't stand the sight of me, because it was like a psychological reference point that consistently reminded her of something that she almost didn't survive. So she abandoned me in the care of a Christian family that adopted me and raised me and loved me and taught me about God. It was crazy. It was almost like Moses, the story of Moses, when he came into the care of like the Egyptians, and how God used him like 40 years later or however old he was. I think he was 43 actually, but he was well along in his life when God reappeared into it and told him, hey, I need you to basically particularly lead my people out of bondage and slavery. I kind of feel like Moses.
Yes.
Never really thought of it that way, because usually my life resonates more with the Apostle Paul in terms of, like, remember how the Apostle Paul used to persecute Christians?
Yes.
I never had a problem with God's people. My rage was against men for what they did to my mother. So I grew up striking them down viciously, like brutally, with no mercy. Always in the back of my mind, thinking that the same mercy they showed my mother is the exact measure I was going to show them, none, when I hurt them in ways that I did. But yeah, I guess
that makes more sense now, Daniel. That makes a lot of sense of just everything you've been through.
I'm sorry, we kind of went in so many different directions. I thought we were just really going to talk about my mom,
Hey, to God's will be done here. So, maybe somebody needs to hear this. And it just explains, I love that the Lord is no respecter of persons. He loves you, Daniel, so much. And yes, like Moses, you are used. Your story is so huge to be used to help others be set free.
Amen. I receive that. Yeah, I receive that. Thank you. Thank you.
Daniel, I just, again, appreciate you coming and sharing with us your story.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate the opportunity.
Absolutely. I want to know, Daniel, as we close, what is the Lord doing with your life these days? How has he been using you? What has he been speaking to you on? And what would you like to say for your final words?
That's a great question. He's been doing so much in my son's life and mine. I would say hope is what God's been filtering and projecting and highlighting through us in so many multi-directions, because one of my favorite, if not the most iconic superhero to me in my life was Supergirl. She had a symbol. She's Superman's cousin. I don't know if you're familiar with superheroes, but she's a reference point to me, because that symbol on her uniform, it represents hope. And that's what God's brought us now to the point of opportunities like this, to be able to connect with people in a way that maybe through seeing or hearing something that resonates with them, they can, like a pilot light of hope can be lit in them, to where they look at it like, well, if God can extend him the grace and mercy and access to salvation that he did, there's hope for me, and that's what I would say is what's the most at this point at the forefront of our lives, is that point of reference, hope.
Amen. Would you pray us out on that word?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you. Father God, we come boldly into your presence right now. That boldness not being based on our own strength, Lord, but in the faith that your word guarantees we have to approach you. In Jesus' name. Lord, your word says that the desires of our heart, you're willing to grant, Lord. Right now, we receive that promise, Lord, because your word also says, where two or more are gathered, there your presence shall be among them. And right now, Lord, believing that your presence is here, Father God, between us, I pray that the desire of my heart be, Lord, that you bless Julie, her family, her ministry, Lord, with your provisions, your love, your peace, Father God. Only you know, Lord, how far this message is going to go. And I pray also, as the desire of my heart, that it resonate with people effectively, Father God, that they find your hope in a fallen world, Lord. I believe prophetically that you're raising an army, Lord, that you're bringing us together from all different parts of the world, all four corners of it, Lord, for your glory to be made manifest. So now, Lord, I just wanted to thank you for this opportunity, Lord, to be a part of this experience. And in Jesus' name, I pray that your name be magnified, Lord, forever and ever. Amen.
Jesus' mighty name. Amen.